You wake up one morning and nothing is visibly wrong. The same room, the same phone lighting up beside your bed, the same people waiting for replies, the same routines pulling at your attention before you've even had a chance to breathe. And yet something has changed. You move through the day as if you're wearing a mask that no longer fits. Conversations feel strangely scripted. Laughter arrives a second too late. Even in a crowded room, you catch yourself looking around with the unsettling feeling that everyone else received instructions for life that somehow never reached you. The hardest part isn't being alone. It's wondering why you can no longer pretend you belong. Maybe you've tried to explain this feeling before. Maybe someone told you that you're overthinking, that you're depressed, that you simply need to get out more, meet new people, stop spending so much time inside your own head. But what if that's not the whole story? What if this growing distance between you and the rest of the world isn't a defect to be fixed, but a consequence of waking up? Not waking up in the mystical sense that social media loves to romanticize. Something quieter than that. More unsettling. A moment when the stories that once held your identity together begin to dissolve. The ambitions that once excited you start feeling borrowed. The opinions you repeated for years suddenly sound like someone else's voice. And once that process begins, there is no obvious way back, because you cannot unknow what you've seen. There is a strange loneliness that arrives when your mind begins asking questions your old life cannot answer. Questions that don't have quick solutions. Questions about meaning, about identity, about whether you've been living according to your own values, or simply following invisible maps handed to you long before you knew you had a choice. Millions of people carry these questions in silence. They go to work. They smile in family photos. They celebrate promotions. They post vacation pictures. And somewhere beneath all of it sits a quiet suspicion that they're participating in a performance whose script they never actually agreed to. It almost feels forbidden to admit this out loud. After all, modern life has given us comforts previous generations could barely imagine. Food appears at our doorstep. Information travels across continents in seconds. Entertainment never ends. Technology has solved problems that once defined entire civilizations. So why does it seem that the more connected the world becomes, the more isolated the individual feels? That contradiction isn't just personal. It may be one of the defining psychological experiences of our time. For most of human history, fitting in wasn't merely comforting. It was survival. Long before cities rose from stone or nations drew borders across maps, our ancestors lived in small tribes where every relationship carried enormous weight. To be accepted meant protection, shared food, and another chance to see tomorrow. To be rejected often meant death. Our nervous systems were shaped inside those ancient realities. Every uncomfortable silence, every awkward glance, every fear of being judged, every urge to seek approval. These aren't random flaws. They're echoes of an older world still living inside a modern brain. Even now, thousands of years later, your body reacts to social exclusion almost as if it were physical pain. Neuroscientists have found remarkable overlaps between the brain regions activated by emotional rejection and those activated by bodily injury. The mind doesn't always distinguish between a broken bone and a broken sense of belonging. That alone explains a great deal. But it doesn't explain everything, because something unprecedented has happened. For the first time in history, millions of people are surrounded by other humans almost constantly, while simultaneously feeling psychologically detached from them. Ancient loneliness usually came from physical isolation. Modern loneliness often arrives in the middle of connection. You can exchange hundreds of messages in a day and still feel unseen. You can accumulate followers without finding a single person who truly understands the questions keeping you awake at night. You can spend every evening surrounded by people while quietly wondering why every conversation seems to orbit around distractions instead of truth. And perhaps the most unsettling realization comes next. The more aware you become of these patterns, the more difficult it becomes to participate in them. There is an old idea that knowledge brings freedom. Sometimes it does. Sometimes knowledge first brings alienation. Because awareness changes your relationship with everything you once accepted automatically. The historian and thinker Yuval Noah Harari has spent years exploring one extraordinary idea. Human beings are unlike any other species because we cooperate through shared stories. Money works because we collectively believe it has value. Nations exist because millions agree to treat invisible borders as real. Corporations, laws, religions, markets, even many aspects of identity itself depend upon collective belief. That doesn't make these things fake. It makes them powerful. Stories can organize civilizations. They can inspire sacrifice. They can create astonishing achievements. But they can also become prisons once we forget that they are stories. The moment you begin seeing the invisible narrative shaping society, something irreversible happens. You start noticing that people often defend ideas, not because they've carefully examined them, but because those ideas give them a sense of belonging. And suddenly disagreements aren't just disagreements anymore. They're perceived as threats to identity itself. Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable people become when someone quietly questions assumptions everyone else treats as obvious? It's rarely the question itself that creates tension. It's what the question threatens. Because beneath many social rules lies an unspoken agreement. Don't shake the foundations that allow everyone else to feel certain. But certainty has always been comforting. Truth has always been costly. History is filled with people who discovered this firsthand. Socrates spent his life asking simple questions that exposed uncomfortable contradictions. The city eventually sentenced him to death. Galileo looked through a telescope and challenged humanity's place in the cosmos. The resistance he encountered wasn't really about astronomy. It was about identity. Throughout history, every major shift in human understanding has carried the same hidden price. The people who see differently often find themselves standing alone before anyone realizes they were looking at the future. That doesn't mean every lonely person is a misunderstood genius. Far from it. Loneliness by itself proves nothing. But genuine transformation often begins with a period where your inner world no longer matches the social world surrounding you. Carl Jung believed that becoming fully yourself required separating from the collective identities you unconsciously inherited. He understood that individuation wasn't comfortable. It was painful. Because every step toward authenticity risks disappointing the groups that once defined you. Children naturally absorb beliefs from parents. Teenagers borrow identities from peers. Adults inherit expectations from careers, politics, culture, religion, and success itself. For years, these borrowed identities feel like your own, until one day they don't. And that day can feel strangely empty. Not because you've lost yourself. Because you've begun discovering how much of yourself was never really yours. That's a frightening realization. Our minds crave stability. They want clean answers. Clear labels. Predictable identities. I'm this kind of person. I believe these things. My future looks like this. These statements calm the nervous system because they reduce uncertainty. But life rarely stays inside those neat categories. Growth has a habit of dismantling the very identities that once made us feel safe. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche warned that when old values collapse, people often experience a terrifying emptiness before new meaning emerges. He wasn't celebrating despair. He was describing a psychological transition that many people mistake for failure. What if the feeling that you don't fit in anymore isn't evidence that something is wrong with you? What if it's evidence that your old psychological framework can no longer contain the questions your mind has started asking? That's a very different possibility. It shifts the focus away from fixing yourself and toward understanding yourself. Because perhaps the deepest loneliness isn't the absence of people. Perhaps it's the absence of shared reality. When your conversations remain on the surface while your thoughts drift toward existence, mortality, consciousness, freedom, or meaning, it begins to feel as though you're speaking a language no one else can hear. You smile, you nod, you answer politely. But somewhere inside, another conversation is unfolding. One that asks whether life is meant to be lived on autopilot. One that wonders why success often feels strangely hollow once it's achieved. One that keeps returning to a single unsettling question. If everyone is rushing somewhere, why does almost no one stop to ask where we're actually going? That question has echoed through human history for thousands of years. And the answer has never been as simple as we hoped. The ancient Stoics believed that most suffering does not come from events themselves, but from the stories we attach to them. Thousands of miles away, Buddhist thinkers reached a remarkably similar conclusion. They observed that the mind spends much of its life chasing identities, possessions, and certainty, only to discover that everything it clings to eventually changes. Separated by continents and centuries, they arrived at nearly the same insight. The human mind is a storyteller. It cannot tolerate chaos for long. So it creates narratives that transform uncertainty into something manageable. It tells you who you are, who other people are, what success means, what failure means, and where your life is supposed to be heading. Most of the time, these stories remain invisible because they feel like reality itself. But every so often, something cracks. A relationship ends. A career you've spent years building suddenly feels empty. Someone you love dies. You experience a quiet moment in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, and the life you've carefully assembled begins to feel strangely unfamiliar. Not because anything outside has changed, because something inside has. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They assume the discomfort means they need to return to who they were before. But consciousness rarely moves backward. Once your mind has expanded enough to question the framework you've been living inside, pretending not to notice becomes exhausting. It's like seeing the strings behind a puppet show. The performance may continue, but it can never feel quite the same again. Modern psychology has a name for this kind of experience. It often appears during periods of identity transition, when the old version of yourself begins dissolving before a new one has fully emerged. During these moments, people frequently report feeling disconnected, not only from others, but from themselves. You don't recognize as your own reactions. Old ambitions lose their emotional pull. Conversations that once entertained you suddenly leave you restless. Even your favorite places can begin to feel like photographs from someone else's life. The temptation is to label this as a crisis. Perhaps it is. But not every crisis is destructive. Some are developmental. Neuroscience offers an intriguing perspective on why this feels so unsettling. Your brain is constantly trying to predict reality before it happens. Every conversation, every routine, every familiar face becomes part of an internal model that helps conserve energy. The more predictable your world becomes, the less conscious effort your brain has to expend. This predictive machinery is incredibly efficient. It's also deeply conservative. Whenever your beliefs begin changing, your brain experiences something similar to instability. The old model no longer explains what you're seeing, but the new model hasn't yet formed. That gap feels uncomfortable, sometimes painfully so. It's the psychological equivalent of walking across a bridge while it's still being built. You know you can't go back, but you can't yet see the other side. Have you ever noticed that during these periods, time itself seems different? Some days pass in a blur, others stretch endlessly. Your attention becomes unusually sensitive. Small interactions linger for hours. Casual remarks echo in your mind long after everyone else has forgotten them. You begin observing rather than participating, watching rather than belonging. At first, this feels like isolation. Then something unexpected begins to happen. You start seeing patterns. The conversation at work repeats itself with different names. The same arguments unfold online every week. The same desires are marketed through different products. The same fears hide beneath different opinions. People appear unique on the surface, yet underneath, many are chasing remarkably similar emotional needs: purity, recognition, control, love. The costumes change, the motivations rarely do. Harari often argues that Homo sapiens became the dominant species, not because we were the strongest animals, but because we became the best at cooperating through shared imagination. Entire societies function because millions of strangers believe in systems they will never personally verify. That ability transformed history. But it also created an extraordinary paradox. The more sophisticated our collective stories became, the easier it became to mistake them for objective reality. Take success. Ask 100 people what it means, and you'll hear surprisingly similar answers. A certain income, a respected career, a beautiful home, recognition from others. Enough achievement to prove that your life mattered. But where did that definition come from? Who wrote it? At what point did we collectively agree that a human being's value could be measured by productivity or visibility? The uncomfortable truth is that many of our deepest goals are inherited long before they are examined. By the time we're old enough to question them, we've often spent years organizing our lives around reaching them. Then one day we arrive and discover that achievement cannot answer questions it was never designed to solve. That discovery can be profoundly lonely. Not because success is meaningless, but because meaning and success are not the same thing. Modern neuroscience reveals something equally fascinating. The brain's reward system is driven less by possession than by anticipation. Dopamine, often misunderstood as the pleasure chemical, is more accurately associated with motivation and expectation. In other words, the chase often feels more exciting than the arrival. This explains why promotions, purchases, and milestones frequently produce only temporary satisfaction. Your brain quickly recalibrates. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. The destination quietly becomes the new starting line. Without realizing it, entire lives can become endless cycles of anticipation, always moving, rarely arriving. Perhaps you've experienced this yourself. You finally buy the thing you wanted, reach the goal you spent years pursuing, earn the approval you believed would change everything. For a brief moment, life feels complete. Then the silence returns, not because you're ungrateful, because the question underneath the goal was never answered. Who am I without something to chase? Few people ask that question. Fewer stay with it long enough to hear the answer. Instead, modern society offers immediate distractions, an endless stream of information, infinite entertainment, constant notifications. Algorithms carefully designed to prevent your attention from resting anywhere for too long. For the first time in history, solitude has become something many people actively avoid. The moment silence appears, we reach for our phones almost automatically. Not because we're weak, because our brains have been trained. Every swipe offers novelty. Every notification carries possibility. Every refresh whispers that something more interesting might be waiting. But there's a hidden cost. The less time you spend alone with your own mind, the more unfamiliar your own mind becomes. This may be one of the defining psychological challenges of the digital age. We have unprecedented access to everyone else's thoughts, while slowly losing contact with our own. Have you ever caught yourself opening an app without remembering why? Or finishing 20 minutes of scrolling only to realize you don't remember a single thing you actually saw? That's not simply poor discipline. It's evidence of an attention economy competing for one resource, more valuable than money, your awareness. And awareness, once fragmented often enough, begins affecting identity itself. If your attention is constantly directed outward, your sense of self gradually becomes dependent on external signals, likes, replies, recognition, agreement for visages. Without noticing, your inner compass begins outsourcing its direction. This is where loneliness takes on a new form. It's no longer just the absence of meaningful relationships. It's the gradual distance between you and your own experience. You stop asking yourself what you genuinely think. Instead, you wonder what everyone else thinks first. Carl Jung warned that whatever remains unconscious eventually shapes our lives without our awareness. Today, that unconscious isn't formed only by childhood or family. It's increasingly shaped by recommendation systems, trending topics, viral opinions, digital tribes. The voices surrounding us have multiplied so dramatically that many people struggle to distinguish between their authentic convictions and the beliefs they've absorbed through repetition. After all, familiarity feels like truth. The brain often mistakes repeated exposure for accuracy. Psychologists call this the illusory truth effect. The more often we encounter an idea, the more believable it becomes, even when we've never examined it critically. Think about how quietly this changes a person. Not through force, not through manipulation that feels obvious, but through thousands of tiny exposures that slowly reshape perception. And then something remarkable happens. The person begins defending beliefs they never consciously chose. Not because they're irrational, because they're human. Every generation believes it sees the world clearly. History suggests otherwise. What if future generations look back at us with the same bewilderment we feel when studying the blind spots of the past? What if the greatest illusion of our era isn't technology itself, but the belief that constant connection has made us more conscious, when in many ways it has simply made us more distracted? That possibility isn't meant to inspire fear. It's meant to invite attention, because the moment you begin noticing these invisible forces, you recover something that no algorithm can manufacture, the ability to observe your own mind. And perhaps that is where genuine freedom begins. Not in escaping society, not in rejecting modern life, but in seeing clearly enough to choose which stories deserve to shape the person you become. The difficult part is that clarity often arrives before companionship. For a while, the path can feel extraordinarily quiet. And yet, history suggests that some of the most important transformations in a human life begin in exactly that silence. Silence has always carried a strange reputation. Most people treat it as something to escape, a gap to be filled, an awkward pause before someone reaches for another topic, another opinion, another distraction. Yet throughout history, the people who changed the way humanity understood itself rarely found their greatest insights in crowds. They found them alone. Marcus Aurelius ruled one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Surrounded by power, wealth, and endless responsibility, he still returned night after night to a private conversation with himself. His journal wasn't